Good afternoon and welcome to the City Club of Cleveland. My name is Paul Harris and I am president of the City Club's Board of Directors. I am very pleased to introduce today's speaker, Steve Phillips, president and one of the first 50 founders of PowerPAC. As stated at its website, PowerPAC is a nonprofit advocacy and political organization established in 2004, quote, to champion democracy and social justice in states and communities across the country, end quote. Before I comment on PACs, I want to say a few words about our esteemed speaker's background. Mr. Phillips grew up in Cleveland Heights, so he's back home today and he has a lot of friends in the audience scattered throughout this room. He attended Stanford University where he majored in English and Afro-American Studies, and he was very active in student organizations. He later earned his law degree from Hastings College of Law in San Francisco. He worked for 4 years with the public interest law firm Public Advocates, and at the young age of 28, was elected to the San Francisco Board of Education, thereby becoming the youngest elected official in San Francisco history. He later became president of the Board of Education and served on the board for 8 years. Our accomplished speaker's appearance today is timely as we enter an election year that is certain to be a very active one, with PACs and super PACs playing a role in the political process. Now, a brief bit of history on PACs. PACs exist at both the federal and the state level. At the federal level, the first PAC was actually formed in 1947. In the 1970s, Congress passed laws governing PACs, including establishing contribution limits. More recently, in the wake of court decisions, including the United States Supreme Court's decision in Citizens United, which was rendered in January of 2010, so-called super PACs have emerged. Now, they're prohibited from making contributions directly to a campaign, but they're able to make unlimited political spending independently of campaigns. The impact of money funneled through PACs and super PACs continues to be hotly debated. Our speaker will present his informed views on that subject, as well, of course, on another hot topic from the 2012 presidential election, the impact of demographic shifts in our country on the 2012 election and on future elections. So with that, I am very pleased to present on behalf of the City Club of Cleveland, Steve Phillips, president and co-founder of PowerPAC.
Thank you, Paul, for that introduction. I'm very grateful to be here. Just an addendum in terms of the bio part. So one of the things that we've created last year through PowerPAC is an organization called PACplus.org, PLUS. And there are actually going to be materials at PACplus.org I'll be referencing through the site, and there's things on the table that we had here as well. We were talking about how there are a lot of friends here, and it's very touching and moving to me. It made me think that, you know, if you ever, this is probably the closest you can have in terms of actually seeing what it would be like, who would come to your funeral, but they're actually dying. And hopefully this won't be a near-death experience for me as I try to deliver these remarks. And I do want to give a special thank you to Subodh Chandra, who introduced me to Dan and arranged this opportunity for me to speak here. Subodh, many people know, a lawyer here in town. He and I have been friends since our days at Stanford in the 1980s. And I always knew Subodh was a smart guy who had great potential, but he really proved it when he decided to marry a woman from Cleveland Heights. And I'm very proud of the leadership that Subodh and Mina have provided around issues of equality and justice, and was privileged to work with Subodh in 2008 around a lot of voter turnout work to bring out people of color to the polls in that election. And I do want to thank all of you for coming out today. It is good to be home. And it is great to see so many friends from my days at Hawkins School and my days on Dartmoor Road. And then I would like to dispel one rumor at the outset, is that I am not here to interview for the Browns head coaching position. So, although although as a longtime Browns fan, my dad got my brothers and I tickets season tickets when we were 7 years old. So I've been a passionate, longtime fan. I'm eagerly following this process and, as always, looking forward to next season. But seriously, though, it's an honor to be invited to speak at the City Club. This is a prestigious platform for anyone to speak from. But for a kid from Cleveland Heights, this is a special honor. And I'm humbled to stand here today. And as if the prestige of the podium wasn't daunting enough, my father, who's here today and flew up from Texas for this, told me that he's heard two people speak at the City Club in his whole life, Martin Luther King and Bobby Kennedy. So no pressure, Dad. But Cleveland is a perfect place to have a discussion about brown is the new white, the future of US politics in the context of America's demographic revolution. Long before America elected a black president, Cleveland blazed the trail by becoming the first major American city to elect a black mayor, Carl Stokes. For those of you under a certain age, that was 1967. And I still remember my mom making a point to drive us by Mayor Stokes' house when we were children on the way to see my grandparents who lived on East 128th Street. Now, a lot has changed in America since 1967, but many in national politics have been slow to appreciate these changes. The fact of the matter is that there is a new majority coalition in America, and that coalition is built on the solid foundation of the country's growing numbers of people of color, and that is what we mean by brown is the new white. To perhaps state the obvious, for the past 400 years or so, the United States has been a majority white country. It is worth noting that the continent had many Native Americans and Mexicans prior to the arrival of Europeans. And that's, we talk about the past 400 years. But for the purposes of understanding contemporary American politics, it's acknowledged that the majority of the country and its voters have been white for a long time. Consequently, addressing the needs of and responding to the interests of whites has been the central organizing principle of US politics for a long time. When people talk about winning over swing voters or not alienating moderates, the picture they have in their head is of suburban whites, often women, frequently in Ohio. In the 1960s, it was Nixon's silent majority. In the 80s, Reagan Democrats. In the 90s, soccer moms, and in the early 2000s, ex-urban voters. These constituencies have been seen as pivotal and have been the focus of politicians and their consultants. Similarly, public policy has been hypersensitive to polling and impressions of what might alienate moderate white voters. Recently, we've seen a lot of articles about how will Americans feel about Obamacare. My first thought was that those Americans who are getting health care for the first time in their life would feel pretty good. But the premise of the question as articulated is how will middle-class whites react to the Affordable Care Act? But that premise is now outdated and anachronistic. One of the masters of American politics is Willie Brown, former mayor of San Francisco and the longest-serving Speaker of the California Assembly. There was a failed coup against Willie in the late 80s, and I saw his speech after he had defeated the coup. And I still remember him saying that the first law of politics is you have to learn to count. Those who are most effective in 2014 and beyond will be those who know how to count. As Bill Clinton famously said in his 2012 Democratic Convention speech, it's about arithmetic. And so let's do a little math today. As I mentioned, that those who are following online or outside of the rooms, that there's a document we have that downloads the data, the statistics I'm going to run through here in a moment. It's available at pacplus.org, PLUS, where we actually have a paper of color that runs through all this work. So the arithmetic, 29 plus 26 equals 55. That is the new equation for this new era. Allow me to explain. The 2010 census confirmed that there has been a profound demographic revolution in America over the past 30 years. Latinos, Asian Americans, African Americans, Native Americans, and mixed race Americans are now 36% of the entire US population. Now, one response when I do these numbers that I hear from people is that not all people of color are progressive. Believe me, I know. So I often shake my head wondering what some of these folks are actually thinking. But the closest statistical measure we have in the country for political ideology is the national exit polls, the presidential exit polls. And that data shows that the vast majority of people of color vote Democratic. In the last election, 80% of the communities of color voted for Obama. So all people of color comprise 36% of the population. 80% of them, once you strip out the conservatives of color, leaves you 29% of the US population. Now, you might look at those numbers and think, well, the percentages of whites have shrunk, but they're still the majority, 60%, plus there's the 7% who are conservatives of color. And that would be correct. That would be good arithmetic. Which brings us to another very important, yet historically neglected and overlooked minority group in America, progressive whites. Progressive whites are the Rodney Dangerfield of American politics. They just don't get any respect. They're frequently belittled or dismissed as irrelevant tree huggers or vegetarians or both. The caricature of progressive whites was captured during the 2004 presidential campaign when a conservative attack ad took aim at Howard Dean supporters by saying, Howard Dean should take his tax hiking, government expanding, latte drinking, sushi eating, Volvo driving, New York Times reading, body piercing, Hollywood loving, left-wing freak show back to Vermont. Now, I live in a very liberal city in San Francisco, and I must confess that some people do drink lattes and read the New York Times. They're still lovely people. But if we look back historically, we will see that the role of progressive whites in American social change has been both heroic and vilified. From the abolitionists and John Brown at Harper's Ferry in 1859, to those who gave their lives in the 1960s civil rights movement, people such as Reverend James Reeb and Viola Luiso in Selma, Alabama, Andrew Goodman and Michael Scherner in Mississippi. Progressives have a long tradition of rejecting their privilege, refusing to stand idly by, and courageously standing with disenfranchised people who are struggling for justice, equality, and democracy. This tradition has touched and improved my own life personally. As far back as 1964, when my parents couldn't buy the home they wanted on Dartmoor Road in Cleveland Heights because they were black. But a progressive white lawyer named Byron Krantz, who worked with fair housing, bought the house for them, deeded it over to them, securing what became the childhood home that I grew up in. In terms of US politics, people have always thought that there were too few progressive whites to matter. But with the growth of the Latino, Black, and Asian populations, that is no longer the case. So if you look again at the exit polls, going back to Jimmy Carter's election, we see that anywhere from 34% to 48% of whites have voted for the Democratic candidate for president. In some years, that was a more courageous act than others. So that's an average of 41% of whites voting Democratic. And so back to the arithmetic. 64% of the country is white. Of that population, 41% are progressives. So that means that the progressive white population in the country is 26% of the entire United States. So you take that 26%, add that to the 29% who are people of color, gives you the 55%, which is the new majority in America. This demographic and mathematical theorem has now been tested and proven twice at the national level with the election and even more importantly, the re-election of President Obama. So what does this mean for US politics going forward? The census data has also given us a geographic map that shows that the future of US politics is in the South and the Southwest. The new battleground states are the old slaveholding states and the Southwest, land that used to be known as Mexico and that we now call Texas, New Mexico, Arizona, and Colorado. Two last numbers I'll throw at you, 19 and 24. 19% of voters of color is the threshold for whether a coalition of people of color and progressive whites can win an election. In the 2010 Republican tidal wave, 3 states withstood the wave and re-elected Democrats to the Senate, Colorado, California, and Nevada. All 3 of those Democrats who won those elections lost the white vote, but were able to prevail because of this coalition. And so Colorado had 19% of its population was voters of color, and we use that as the benchmark. And then this is where the picture starts to come most sharply into focus. There are 24 states in America that will soon have 19% voters of color. And those states are overwhelmingly in the South and the Southwest. Arizona, Georgia, and Texas are the new battleground states. Yes, Texas. One of the most important races in the country this year will be Wendy Davis's run for governor of the state of Texas. If the Democrats take Texas, It will cut the legs out of the conservative political machine and make it nearly impossible for a Republican to win the White House for the next 20 years. Georgia, which Barack Obama lost by only 6 percentage points without even contesting the race, represents the Democrats' best opportunity for a senatorial pickup this year as Michelle Nunn runs for the seat that her father once held. So these 24 states have 351 electoral votes. It takes 270 to be elected president. These 24 states have 303 congressional seats. 218 is the magic number for majority in the House. These states have the power to elect the next president and secure the control of the Congress. When Jesse Jackson ran for president, he used to say that the hands that once picked cotton and lettuce can now pick presidents, senators, and governors. And so if Democrats were smart, they would be massively investing in communities of color in the South and the Southwest. Conservatives have done the math, and it's no accident that they are massively investing in efforts to restrict voting rights in the South and the Southwest. Now, while Obama's campaign did spend considerable resources mobilizing and turning out these new majority voters in North Carolina, Virginia, Nevada, Florida, and Colorado for several months in 2012, with the results to show for it, there is nonetheless still no lasting strategy, program, or leadership pipeline carried out by the Democrats in these key areas. Apparently, too many Democrats have trouble with math. And there is a shocking underinvestment in the communities of color as too many campaigns continue to chase the ever-shrinking block of moderate white voters instead of building up the coalition of the future. Many Republicans, on the other hand, are apparently better at math than Democrats. Now, admittedly, on the surface, it looks like that Republicans are locked in a fierce internal battle. You have the Tea Party, who I would submit is fighting the last losing battle of the Civil War, desperately and destructively trying to tear down the entire government rather than let Barack Obama, the duly elected president, address the nation's problems. The early indications, however, are that the Tea Party movement has crested. With the implosion of the Tea Party challenger to Governor Kasich, we see that happening here in Ohio as well. And other more sophisticated Republican forces are asserting themselves, forces who know arithmetic and know it well. 8 years after losing to the first black president, the Republicans will likely field a set of presidential candidates that is 30 to 40% candidates of color. Marco Rubio, Ted Cruz, and Bobby Jindal are all running as fast as they can, while the Democratic bench is surprisingly empty. And although New Jersey Governor Chris Christie has a new set of problems on his hand, which I must admit I was enjoying watching, he has nonetheless spent the past few years meticulously distancing himself from the reactionary elements in his party, courting Latino and black voters, and he recently made a point to sign immigration reform into law in the state of New Jersey. And so Democrats run the very real risk of getting complacent in the face of Republican internal squabbles and of underestimating the Republican threat to their base. Historically, Republicans have been so bad on matters of race and equality that Democrats have not had to do anything. Soon, however, they will actually have to contest for the votes of people of color and make an argument about why they are better than the Republicans at addressing the needs of the communities of color. And that is an argument that few Democrats, frankly, are familiar with or comfortable making. Lastly, what are the policy implications of the emerging new majority in America? I tell my friends who spend a lot of time developing position papers and reasoned arguments to influence the public policy debate that as a general rule, elected officials will support any policy that they think will get them reelected. Which brings us back to the question of just who they think are doing the electing and the unelecting, and who will be the voters in the upcoming elections. Let's look at healthcare as a case study. If you're primarily concerned about moderate, middle-class white voters, then you might well be nervous about Obamacare. There will undoubtedly be some people whose premiums go up, albeit to pay for more robust coverage, and that part's lost in the hubbub sometimes. But if your objective is to solidify loyalty among the rapidly growing Latino population in America, you should note that Latinos have the least access to health care of any demographic group in the country, with 35% lacking health insurance. So rather than wringing your hands and worry about how Obamacare is polling among moderate whites, smart politicians should be out in the Latino community every day championing how many people are now getting health care, how many children can now see a doctor, how many sick people can finally get treatment. And then they should be smacking their opponents upside the head with ads asking why they think that the richest nation in the history of the United States, in history of the world, should deny people access to basic health care. How is that moral or right or religious? In one stroke, you can win over your growing base, put your opponents on the defensive, and also win over church-going moderate whites by appealing to their sense of morality and religion. After all, the Bible does command us to care for the sick and address the needs of the least of these. Another example of the policy implications of the new majority is economic inequality. If you look at a map of the distribution of poverty in America, you'll see that the heaviest concentrations of poverty fall largely along the same lines as the rising Black and Latino populations, the South and the Southwest. And although these regions are seen as conservative, they're what's called unnaturally conservative, and they have the least to conserve. Again, a smart politician would champion the minimum wage increase, use that as an argument to win over low-income whites as well as people of color. The party who cracks that code will rule politics in this country for decades to come. I titled this talk, "Brown is the New White," because frankly I wanted to get people's attention. And one way to do that is to be explicit about issues of race and ethnicity. But part of why it gets attention is because addressing race touches on deep-seated fears and insecurities about how the country is changing, fears about how a cherished way of life is perceived to be disappearing. And in fact, you can't truly understand politics in America today without appreciating the interplay between the demographic revolution and the efforts by too many demagogues in Congress who whip up fear and stoke insecurity and attempt to foment opposition to anything that is proposed by our African-American commander-in-chief. But let me just close with the good news that you have nothing to fear. You know that people of color like good food. You know we make good music and culture. Turns out that many of us are sociable and smart and share the same values as you. In fact, those of us who come from communities that have faced discrimination and oppression are actually often the most hopeful and idealistic of all. In Dr. King's famous speech, he said, "And even though we face the difficulties of today and tomorrow, I still have a dream. It is a dream deeply rooted in the American dream." So if you're worried, put aside your fears, and let's work together to build a better America. If you're a progressive white, your time has finally come. As my friend Van Jones says, if blacks don't vote, greens don't win. And if you're a person of color, let's grasp the role of responsibility that history has presented us. The Bible says that the rejected stone will be the cornerstone of the new order. Let's use that cornerstone to build a new social structure in America that we can all be proud of, a structure of opportunity, equality, and justice for all. Thank you very much.
Today at the City Club of Cleveland, we are listening to a Friday forum featuring Steve Phillips, president and co-founder of PowerPack. We'll return to our speaker in a moment for a traditional City Club question and answer period. And I'd ask that you start formulating your questions now and try to keep them brief and to the point so we can get as many questions in as possible. We welcome all of you here and those joining us via broadcast on WVIZ PBS, 90.3 WCPN, and 104.9 WCLV IdeaStream, WTAM, or one of the many broadcast partners we have here at the City Club across the country. Broadcasts of the City Club are made possible by Cleveland State University and PNC, and our live webcast is supported by the University of Akron. Next Friday, 1 week from today, January 17, the City Club will host a breakfast program with Norton Bonaparte, city manager for Sanford, Florida, who helped the city manage emotions and policies after the Trayvon Martin killing. We will also host a lunchtime forum featuring Sue Helper, Chief Economist of the United States Department of Commerce, as part of our Business Leader Series. Now, for a complete list of our upcoming programs, to make a reservation or to order a CD or DVD of one of our many programs, please visit our website, and that's www.cityclub.org. We welcome our many guests today at tables hosted by Baker and Hostetler, Cleveland State University, Hawkins School, which is, as Steve mentioned, is his alma mater, his high school alma mater, Policy Matters Ohio, the Chandra Law Firm, and our strategy. Thank you all for your support today. We welcome students to today's program. Student participation is made possible by a generous gift from the Freddie Shaw Charitable Foundation. Today we welcome students from Cleveland Heights High School. We also have students from Hawkins School here, so I'm going to ask all our students to stand and be recognized. And just a reminder that students get to ask questions. Now we'll return as promised to our speaker for our traditional City Club question and answer period. We welcome questions from everyone, including guests and students. Holding the microphones today are Development Associate Mike Cromaldi and Administrative Assistant Kirsten Pianka. Where's Kirsten? Okay, there she is. First question, please.
I want to thank you for being here. Your presentation was wonderful. My question is, there's this arrogance problem with a lot of people who feel like they know everything. And so even though what you're saying is really logical, it's still difficult to get some folks to say, you know, you're right. So I guess my question is, how do you move, and I'm speaking of, you know, Democrats basically, how do you move them off of that, you know, my way is the best way and I know what I'm doing, to begin to embrace some of your ideas? I know that's a really hard question, but just wanted to see what you're going to say.
I was hoping you would have the answer for me for that question. I mean, frankly, that is one of the big challenges. And then it's almost endemic to a certain extent to the proposition, is that if you help elect somebody president of the United States, then you're going to think you're a very big deal, right? And so that you know a lot. And so that's part of the challenge, people not actually appreciating that. And I don't think, frankly, it's as much an issue of just making the logical numerical argument. People know what they know what they're familiar with, and they tend to do that. So I think a couple of different things that we've been looking at trying to move forward. So one is, I think that we have to be thinking about what is the pipeline and the leadership development work that we're actually doing. Identifying people from diverse backgrounds, encouraging them to go into campaigns, supporting them to be able to do that, and helping them to move forward in that regard. And it applies at every different level. And I do want to both acknowledge and commend State Senator Nina Turner, who has an African-American woman running her campaign. That's an unusual thing in U.S. politics. And so we need more candidates who are going to do that. When Cory Booker ran for his Senate race, he had an African-American man become the person who ran his race. Those types of apprenticeship experiences start to create and put people in place. But I do think that we're also going to have to make raise our voices. And so if you look towards 2016 in particular, which is going to be the next major piece, we've got to be asking about this and actually be pushing people at every level. And I've seen now the career path. There's a woman who used to work for me. We were doing our Super PAC work in 2007 in California, who wound up moving to Ohio, doing the statewide field campaign, Jen Brown, and that's put her in a position to be the executive director of a major effort in the state of Texas. But you move up from level to level, and so it matters to actually be asking at whatever level you're connected to, your county, your region, your state, asking the question, well, who are you actually promoting, who are you investing in? But I do think it's largely going to be incumbent upon those of us who want to see this happen to both be a squeaky wheel around it, as well as trying to be nurturing and elevating the next generation of people who want to do this kind of work.
Your statistics seem to be based on the last two presidential elections, where a very charismatic African American was up. What would have happened, and how would those statistics have been skewed if, in fact, that we have, at which we very well might have in the next presidential election, a white candidate?
Yeah, well, that's the $64,640 million question, I think, in a lot of ways. And it's really going to be, we're going to see how that's going to play itself out within, and I was actually thinking about doing a gathering or bring people together around the question about after the black president, and that really starting to have that conversation and what is that actually going to look like. But so that was very helpful and should not be minimized. Yet lost under the understanding of what the Obama campaign did, and this was all talk about, it was an aspiring African-American candidate, you had a lot of technology and cutting edge tools. At the end of the day, they had thousands of paid staff people doing the methodical drudge work of going door to door, contacting people, identifying people, turning them out. So there's that. The other point I would make is that there's also a challenge around what is the policy agenda, in that are we articulating a policy agenda which will speak to people and bring out people who don't necessarily usually vote. So many of the people who've waged minimum wage campaigns have run on a theme of vote yourself a raise. And so then it becomes a more tangible point around why you're actually voting beyond just this particular person. Although I would submit that for 2016, we saw, though I feel in many ways the '08 election was the culmination of 40 years of the civil rights movement. There's a reason that Oprah and Jesse Jackson were crying at his piece. I mean, there had been such a history around what that meant. The next wave of what is pent up within this country in terms of leadership and the ascendance of leadership is the issue of women's leadership, women's empowerment, women's role in running the country. And I think that as much as there was a strong sentiment that propelled people around electing the first African-American president, I'm already seeing there's going to be a similar sentiment around electing the first woman president. And I think that will be a big factor in turnout in 2016.
Thank you. If I think about a little history, back in the 1800s, there were signs, Irish need not apply. And my ancestors from Italy, Italians were not allowed in Shaker Heights at somewhat early on. To what degree do you see what's happening with people of color as kind of an extension or not an extension of what's already happened, where it used to be that Irish and Italians were considered sort of outside of the fold, where now everybody would think of them as just white and wouldn't think anything about it?
I do think that that's taking place. There's the writer James Baldwin wrote a collection of his works called The Price of the Ticket. In his intro essay there, he says that the price of the ticket for the European immigrants was to become white. And so that definitely has taken place. And you do frankly see it in different regards, particularly in terms of different elements of the Latino and Hispanic community. In some segments, I think of the Asian community, there's a desire to be treated in just that kind of mainstream fashion. The challenge is that, color is so ingrained in terms of our society, in terms of the perceptions, in terms of a lot of the biases and prejudices. I mean, Dr. King talked about the numbers of synonyms for the word black versus the number of synonyms for the word white and what the connotations of those were. That this is very deep within the culture and psychology of the country around these color line, the color issues. So it's more difficult when you look that different to just be assimilated in. And so I think that that's going to be part of the challenge. And then frankly, I think the hope would be that we would actually move to a point of not wanting to sublimate the distinctive pieces, but to embrace and validate and weave all that together. People talk the difference between a melting pot and a salad bowl, where it's all in there, but it's kind of mixed together, but you maintain the different distinctive characteristics and the distinctive flavor of the various communities.
Mr. Phillips, as a conservative and someone who believes in liberty, I probably come out at a different solution than you on some things, but I accept, as I think many do, the challenge that those of us who believe differently also have an obligation to communicate with the brown community. But my question is, with respect to your statistics, there was recently, I think at the University of Akron, there was a seminar, and it talked about one of the best predictors, actually, for example, of voting patterns was religious affiliation or religious belief, rather than race or anything else for that matter. And there's a lot of folks who are of color, African-American churches, Hispanics who are very active in their churches, who I think the polls suggest come out to a very different point than the progressive point of view on a number of issues, whether it's the social issues, whether it's limited government, fiscal conservatism, a lot of other things. Isn't there the likelihood that what we need to do is come together somewhere more in the middle rather than the extremes of either end, and have a conversation more about a range of ideas and a range of solutions?
I think I agree with that. I mean, we used to talk back in the 80s with the phrase said it's not about left wing or right wing, it's about the moral center. And one of the critiques I have of the progressive faith communities that we don't associate the progressive agenda enough with the strong religious and biblical underpinnings of things like dealing with poverty and addressing health care, et cetera. And I actually think that that is a potential area to be able to come together. And let me be clear, my fundamental point is also a challenge to progressives and Democrats that they cannot take people of color for granted. And that George Bush was very effective within Texas around understanding and validating the cultural reality, the cultural sentiments of the Latino community, a very effective record around that. His faith-based initiative won over a number of different folks in those communities towards being allied with him. And then, people used to say back in the day, it's no permanent friends, no permanent enemies, about permanent interest, and that we're talking about addressing and improving the conditions of people in the society, extending the benefits of the American dream broadly. And I think there are things that can be done in that regard. My wife and I were talking about how there's a lot more common ground now among conservatives and liberals around criminal justice issues. And that it's a very expensive proposition to go about criminal justice work the way that we do it in this country. And some of the Republican leaders in the South, Mississippi and I, are talking about de-incarceration, alternative ways to rehabilitate people. That's a type of a solution. We were very supportive of Cory Booker, who we went to college with as well. He's looking at reaching across the aisle to different Republicans around some of these sentencing reform issues. So I'm all for, particularly since nothing can get passed in the current situation, is that where we can find agreement, I'm all for that. And I'm not necessarily arguing that it should be a proposition that just moves in that regard. And I think that there are a lot of things that the Democrats in particular have been slow on in terms of validating a lot of these different pieces around the importance of faith in people's lives, the values that flow from that, and building an agenda that speaks to that as well. So I do think there's work to be done in that regard.
I would.
Hi, my name is Del Case. I just wanted to say, Steve, as a Hawken alumni, I'm sure I speak for the Hawken community, how proud we are of you and what you have become in your life. And I was just reminiscing to think 35 years ago, I used to sit in your small little TV room and watch you dip French fries into your Frosty there, and we used to think you were kind of weird, but I just want to say just how impressed and how happy we are with what you are trying to achieve. But on a serious note, my question is, I know your talk is the browning of America and the new states that would be these states to now look at as far as Texas and things of that nature. But right now, Ohio always seems to hold itself around election time as being a very pivotal and important state. Mm-hmm. And before we would to move on from that, what do you think, or what would be your recommendation for Ohio specifically? Because it always comes down to that last night. And it's always, we just never know which way we're going to swing. And I would love to have maybe a blueprint or some plan or just some advice from your perch point as to what Ohio could specifically do for 2016 and even now with our government, our governor election coming up. So maybe you could help with that.
Right. So back in high school, you didn't think I'd amount to much, did you? Right. So, no, Ohio remains still one of the bellwether states within the country. And in a lot of ways, interestingly, because Ohio is almost split right down the middle in terms of its electoral trends, efforts in Ohio make a bigger difference because the margin is so small. And so if you can actually increase the participation, that has an impact. It's worth studying and understanding better what Obama did to be able to win here, and that they increased significantly the African-American turnout in ways that really, if you read these post-election books, shocked the Romney people and shocked Karl Rove. We watched his meltdown on election night. He couldn't believe that was transpiring. But their models were wrong in terms of how many people of color, how many African-American people they thought would actually turn out. So this is really, this is part of the challenge too, is that this work it should not just be episodic work. It should not be every 4 years in October we try to actually turn folks out. what is the civic engagement infrastructure and involvement and leadership development that's going on around the clock? And so it's almost back to the civic club type of days, is that people who were a precinct leader on turning out for Obama, can they be supported to be civic leaders and getting people to the city council meeting or to be part of a block club? Or so you start to know who all of your neighbors are. You continue to have that relationship. So when election time comes around, you know who the folks are. You're not just returning out to them. So I think when I was meeting with State Senator Turner today, talking about how much has been preserved of the Obama infrastructure. And that, I think, is one of the biggest challenges. I think that's something we can all think about doing, is how to actually sustain the activists, the organizers who get inspired and do this work between election cycles. So the extent that we're able to preserve that kind of infrastructure will enable, I think, us to continue to have the outcomes that we want to see.
In spite of Ohio's division between Republicans and Democrats in presidential elections, we have apportionment of congressional districts done in such a way that there's believed to be only one competitive district in the state of Ohio, and that's the Lake and Geauga County, La Tourette's former district. So I would like you to address the issue on a broader basis of the, so I'd say, malapportionment of congressional districts and its impact on the progressive movement.
Yeah, I really believe that redistricting is going to be the most important political fight of the next 20 years. And so that it's underappreciated how much, with the Republican wave of 2010, taking over all these different state houses and then drawing the lines of 2011, has locked in a undemocratic configuration of congressional districts. Democrats won more people voted for Democrats for Congress than voted for Republicans, but Republicans still have an 18-seat majority in the House. And that's just a configuration of redistricting and gerrymandering, frankly. So we've got, but I feel like that progressives were asleep at the switch. There was a lot of effort and a lot of around the census, get people signed up for the census, but very little resources, very little effort, very little organizing around then engaging in the actual drawing of the lines. And so we need to be vigilant and proactive around that. So it's 7 years from now, so we should all mark it on our calendars that we've got to be engaged in that process. And the other thing to think about is, are there ways to also democratize the line drawing work? So we were able to pass a resolution in ballot measure in California that took it out of the hands of the state legislature. And so the lines were actually drawn by a neutral commission than just looking at the data and the numbers and not factoring in. And ironically, it's actually helped Democrats in California, because you start to see how much the previous lines have been drawn to protect particular individuals. And they weren't as concerned about the overall configuration. It's like, don't mess with my individual district, I'm less concerned. But if you just take that personal consideration out, cut the lines according to what the data actually shows around what the demographics are like, you actually get better results. And so it's something to think about. I know there was an effort to actually try to get a commission here that was not successful in Ohio, but it's something to not give up on, is that if you can actually have it be a more objective piece, then you can draw lines that reflect what is the actual composition. Because you're correct, in a state that's this divided, that's this close every presidential election, you shouldn't have a 2/3 majority of one party within the state legislature. That's not reflective of who's within the state, and I think it is worth engaging in that fight to be able to draw lines that are fair and reflective of who's within the state.
Okay, thank you. You mentioned some of the issues that the Republican Party seems to be having. You mentioned infighting and potentially the cresting of the Tea Party, but you also cited, I think you called them sophisticated Republican forces that are emerging, and I was hoping to ask you to educate us a little bit about some of these forces that you see and what we might want to know about them and watch what they're doing.
Well, I mean, I think before his recent troubles, we'll see how that plays itself out, but I think Chris Christie has been actually quite masterful at his political route that he's taken within New Jersey, and that he is quite the contrary of all the hostility and vitriol we see about the president. He's like literally embracing the president and working together jointly across party lines on problems addressing the state of New Jersey. So then that creates a certain profile and a certain image. And then he's been very meticulous around reaching out to leaders within the different communities of color. And that he actually had, and then it's not an accident that the House refuses to even take up immigration reform. But they passed a state-based DREAM Act for immigration reform in New Jersey. And I mean, he whittled it down a little bit, but basically he signed that deal. And so I know one of the more left pro-immigration Latino advocacy groups has on their Facebook page, yay, Chris Christie, great job that you're doing around this type of a piece. So I think you see that. Then, like yesterday, Marco Rubio is starting to look at, speak up about poverty issues and inequality. So the president has staked this out, that there's growing inequality in the country, we have to be able to deal with this. There's pushes around the minimum wage. So then Rubio is starting to talk about, well, there are other ways to go about dealing with it. So historically, people have not addressed those issues. And so we've been able to just say, we stand for this, we stand for ending poverty, we stand for multicultural inclusion. And that's been that's been sufficient to define the distinctions between the parties. But when you have both parties saying, no, we're for ending poverty too, we're for dealing with cultural diversity as well, then it's then you have to dig deeper, and that's what I'm saying. Democrats are not as used to doing that actually, and are going to actually have to be more intentional and assertive around putting forward what they think should be the agenda to meet people's needs.
Looking at our current Senate, they're a little bit notorious for not being able to pass any bills at all. And this is an issue that it seems like both political parties are going to have to address. Do you see an area where we could start to compromise around this issue of colored voters, and where both parties come together to create a mutually beneficial agreement that benefits both the political parties and the people that are voting?
Give me a minute on that one. I think, just quite frankly, I think that it is no accident that there are so many efforts to suppress the vote right now. Is that there's a very clear understanding that the more diverse the voting population becomes, the expectation is the worse that it's going to be for the Republicans. And so that is why you see these efforts to, throw up all manner of legal roadblocks. One would think that this is a democracy, and that in a democracy you would want everybody to vote, and that we should be doing everything we can to encourage people to vote. And it was particularly maddening to me watching in Florida, people standing in line for hours and hours and hours trying to be able to vote, with the governor, his own constituents, not seeming to care that his people were going through that kind of difficulty, because it was serving actually a his political end. So it's going to be a challenge. I think the one thing that I could potentially think about is some of the folks who are actually trying to get ahead of this curve. Marco Rubio's of the world, he tried to stake out this position around immigration reform, trying to do this piece around the poverty part. Can you look at some of those folks to be able to partner? And I think it would actually be in their interest to be seen within these communities as being concerned about the needs and about the interest. The other idea, the potential is out there. What I wonder is how much we can actually try to achieve common ground around the application of technology. Right? When you go to the department store, and you don't have to wait. You pull out your credit card and you can buy whatever you want to buy right then. So why is it so difficult to vote? Right? If they can verify who you are when you want to spend some money, why can't we verify right away who somebody is when we want them to actually vote? And I keep wondering, can we look at partnering with Google and Apple's of the world to be able to have that technological validation in ways that might cross some partisan boundaries?
Welcome home.
Thank you.
So we now understand your thesis that brown is the new white and that that's going to fundamentally change the political dynamic in our country. Could you tell us more about what your organization, PAC Plus, is doing to leverage that opportunity, what they're doing specifically in Ohio, around the country, what they're planning on doing, and how people can get involved if they want to?
So, well, what we're trying to do is to create an infrastructure and a vehicle to respond to this changing demographic moment. And so we want to connect and coordinate progressive people across the country, use technological tools to be able to pool resources and move resources and coordination to strategic races in these states that are going through demographic changes. So we pooled money from across the country, moved money last year to support Wendy Davis when she was running for re-election to the state Senate in Texas before she became famous this past year. And so we pooled resources, put money behind Cory Booker, becoming the next Democratic senator, African-American senator within the US Senate. So we're looking for people like that across the country, and we're really frankly trying to diversify the population of elected officials and the elected leadership within the country in a way that we can have people who are both inspiring and committed to addressing the needs of the country's new majority. And so looking at, in some ways, people referred to us as an Emily's List for candidates of color type of a model. And so that's the work that we're trying to do, and also trying to put good information and data out there so we can, people can really understand what is actually happening. We can make public policy and political plans based upon an appreciation of actual good arithmetic. So that's the basic thrust in the work. People can learn more and can sign up at pacplus.org, PLUS, and it's been an enjoyable work creating this kind of vehicles, enabled us to get connected with a lot of like-minded and idealistic people across the country.
Mr. Phillips, you said earlier that a lot of communities of color want to be treated as part of the mainstream, and as a result, they may shy away from grouping together to have these hard discussions about politics and race. So how can communities of color overcome this barrier and start having these discussions?
I'm a strong believer in the power of leadership, in that we have to be able to identify, support, and then connect leaders within all of these different communities. And so if you just look back historically, and we saw the movie on Mandela over the holidays, and that if you just start to understand some of how the South African freedom struggle came together, is you have leaders and leaders create organizations, and those organizations relate to their communities. And so without those leaders who are connecting people, educating people, informing people, encouraging others to participate, it's going to be very difficult. And so I think that is something I've been very focused on, is trying to identify energetic, committed, conscientious, talented, younger people to take on a leadership role and to be able to encourage and work with and educate and move their communities. And that, I think, is really one of the core critical components of it. And then additionally, that if we can get people within each of those communities doing work with their communities, to then those leaders have relationships with one another. That's then how you start to build a very broad, multiracial, inclusive movement that can move the country forward.
Hi, my name is Christina Skovskard. I would like to ask, since you said that about 80% of all brown America is Democratic leaning, how would you see it if the Republicans were smart enough to run a candidate like Condoleezza Rice? Would the brown community support her, do you think? That's one question. And my other question to you is, why has the Affordable Care Act created such a rift in America? I mean, it's not just created a rift among corporate America, but it's also created a rift among Americans themselves. It's like a topic you just don't ever want to bring up.
On the Condi Rice thing, well, my first flip thought is don't give them any ideas, right? And interestingly, there was talk about her running for Senate or governor in California, which I was frankly concerned about, precisely because of these reasons. She's not seen as an ideological figure. She's a woman. She's African American. She would be an appealing candidate, but she did not fit the conservative orthodoxy of elements of the California Republican Party. So she couldn't get the support to actually be able to move that forward. And then similarly, when Colin Powell was thinking about running for president in '96, he would have been formidable as well. But I mean, these things, we do have which gets to your next question, a contentious history within this country, right? I think we don't often like to talk about it, but we've come together through taking the land from the Native Americans, taking the Southwest from the Mexicans, enslaving Africans. And the way the country has been built with all of that history is still very challenging, and it's still, I feel, at the core of a lot of the politics of the country. And so people like Condoleezza or Colin Powell are more sensitive to that history and want to speak to that, and want to address these inequities within our society. And that there's another very vociferous, what I would say far-right political grouping, which wants to preserve the status quo as unequal as it is, because they have some benefit within it. And so that's a big part of the tension. And then it somewhat ties into the healthcare piece is that, you know, it's, someone talked about that when we had the war on poverty, which is the 50th anniversary now, that when Bobby Kennedy went to West Virginia and talked about we have poverty and lifted up poor children, that touched something in everybody about these children, this is not right. We should do something about that. It touched the morality, the conscience of the nation. Part of the challenge of the history of the country is that we feel a sense of otherness. And so whether a child looks differently or doesn't speak our language, there's not the same empathetic response that we have had. So this notion around everybody should have health care because we're a great nation that has the capacity and that's what our values are, is not the way the conversation is playing out, which is one of my frustrations with the White House, frankly. And so instead it's like those people are getting health care and taking money from me. And it's this division, and that's partly, I think, which is tied to the historic divisions within the country. So I think that's why we've actually had this, but my hope is that we can elevate that debate to the level of who are we as a nation that is inclusive of all of us, speaks to our values and embraces all of us, regardless of what we look like or what we might sound like. Thank you.
Today at the City Club, we have been listening to a Friday forum featuring Steve Phillips, president and co-founder of PowerPack. Thank you very much, Mr. Phillips. Thank you, ladies and gentlemen. This forum is now adjourned.